Hi, today I want to take a look at the Novation Launchkey 61 and how I use it in a composing workflow. In this case, Cubase specifically, but what I'm saying could easily apply to Logic, Reason, or any other DAW. Now, full disclosure, I was sent this keyboard for my review, so I've been using it for a couple months to test it out and see what features I like, what are helpful to me, what's good for my workflow, and what I'm not using so much. So first I want to take a look at what this keyboard has to offer and then what I find helpful. Let's take a look at the built-in features on our launch key. So we first have our LCD panel, which just gives us our readings for what we're doing with our controls. Our shift button is going to allow us to control any of this gray text through here, as well as access additional features on these buttons and use the pads, pot modes, or fader modes through here. Settings is going to get us into device settings. We'll talk about that a little bit later. For Cubase specifically, our track navigation is going to be primarily with these arrows. These are going to allow us to page through our banks of tracks to select what we need to select without actually having to get to a mouse. We have this, which is also a navigation mode, which lets us actually use these as arrow keys for going up and down in our session. So you can see I'm selecting different tracks here just using these keys right here. If I use my arrow over, I'm selecting the clip next to the track. And of course, our other button here, which is green in real life, is an enter button. So for this case, it's opening that lower zone on Cubase. Aside from navigation, fixed chord, so we can choose a chord that we're using. We have our arpeggiator on our scale modes, as well as our octave buttons, which also, if we hit shift, allow us to transpose. So it's a little bit hidden if you're looking for transpose on this keyboard, as opposed to just changing octaves. We actually have to hold shift to make these octave buttons turn into transpose buttons. I do like this feature here that when we are using these as octave buttons or transpose buttons, you'll see that they actually light up the intensity of the transposition or the octave change. So at 12 semitones, this is a much brighter button than if I am transposed only 4 semitones. To reset, simply click both and we're done with that. Same for octaves. I can reset by clicking both at the same time and I am back to a middle C. Pitch bend, modulation, pretty self-explanatory. We are not going to be using these buttons really in Cubase as well as this. Basic controls that we have on this keyboard, we have pad modes, pot modes, and fader modes, in addition to the control settings that we can use to navigate, control our arpeggiator, chords, things like that. We also have the ability to capture MIDI. This is retrospective recording in Cubase. Start and stop our session, record, loop back to where we were, undo, quantize, and activate a click track. One quick note about this keyboard is these lights are actually much brighter and more saturated in person. I can't get them to render through on video as I would like, but if you get it, I think you'll be impressed by how bright and how dim they go, so they have quite a range in terms of their level of brightness. The settings that we have on the device itself, when plugged in, we can control the MIDI channel that we're using for the keys, the MIDI channel used for chords, the MIDI channel used for drums, velocity curve of the keys, velocity curve of the pads. I have it set to hard because it just works better for me. There are pad aftertouch, in this case polyphonic, pad aftertouch threshold, pot pickup, which is really helpful to make sure that nothing happens with your faders changing information in your DAW until the fader reaches that threshold of where the information should be. And MIDI clock out and our brightness control. So we have from brightness from 1 all the way up to 16. One feature that we have with this MIDI controller is actually it's built in as a MIDI remote. So with Cubase 12 and beyond, it'll show up here in the session as a MIDI remote. And this will show you what is happening on each of your controls. Let's take a look a little bit more at the arpeggiator here. So we have a lot of built-in arpeggiator controls. I'm going to first go into arpeggiator so that I am on an arpeggiator for my track. Right now I have it so that arpeggiation is controlled by these texts here. So we have the arpeggiation type, up, and down, played, random, chord. We can change that with shift, holding any of these buttons. We can change the rate in the same fashion, decide what rate you want. Let's say I'm going for quarter note triplets. Oh, we're still on chord mode. Let's take that away. Change to up and down. At this tempo, my triplets are pretty slow. Then I can change octaves. I can add additional octaves as well. Let's go back to the 16th. And then rhythm. So this is our typical rhythm deviation here, where we just simply have the played every note. Or where we have a space between notes. 2 spaces between notes. Random. Or deviate. We'll talk a little bit more about deviate and mutate in terms of our arpeggiator type and our rhythm patterns in a minute. So going back to our main arpeggiator here, I actually prefer, instead of using the keys and the arpeggiator button with shift, you can of course lock your arpeggiation on by holding shift and clicking the arpeggiator. Now, whatever I'm playing, I'm in the arpeggiator, and I lock it on. It's gonna keep playing for us. I can either stop it by clicking arpeggiator and it's off again. But the mode I actually prefer for the arpeggiator is getting into the pads for the arpeggiator. It's just a little bit easier, I think, to do with the arpeggiator, and especially if you're playing one-handed chords. So to do that, I'm just going to hold it to where the pad is now actually glowing. Now the lock is still on. Let me turn that off. But here, now that the pad is glowing, you can see that my pads have actually changed here. So the arpeggiator pad is glowing to show that I am now using the pages here to navigate my arpeggiator instead. I'm going to get out of rhythm mode. So here is my type. It's going up, down, up and down, as played, random, chord, and then I can actually change from there and then mutate. So mutate is pretty cool because what it does is it starts adding in notes to whatever you're playing. So if I have this on mutate and I use my mutate knob here, I'll combine that with some octaves. Let's drop it down. And change some modes. It's pretty powerful for what we can choose to do with it. Now this isn't being super creative because I'm using just a simple chord, but I can go back to my mutate button here. I'm going to take away the octaves. I can choose swing if I prefer something like that. Let's go back to slower so that we can hear this swing better. For what it's worth, you can use swing for sure. And then, of course, you can control your tempo of your arpeggiator here. In Cubase, I prefer not to mess with that because it will change the tempo of the arpeggiator separately from your session tempo. So just be aware that it can get a little bit screwy if you mess with that and don't think about it when you're recording in. And then we also have Strum Mode. Now I'm going to switch to mandolin for Strum Mode. So the clearest demonstration of what Strum Mode does is it allows us to choose the speed that we're actually playing the chosen note. So if I play 4 notes here, you'll notice nothing comes out until I now move my modulation wheel. If I move it up, it will play notes bottom to top at whatever speed I am moving the mod wheel. So now that I'll move the mod wheel down, it's going to play the notes top down. So our different pad modes that we have on this keyboard, of course, we have our session mode, which is going to be navigating our tracks in the session. If I keep hitting this track navigation, it's dropping me between the tracks in the session. You can see the colors change as we navigate all the many tracks in this session. Session mode also allows me to not only select different tracks, but of course they're all record armed because that's the way I work, solo and mute as well. So mute is our top line, solo is our bottom line of buttons here. And to change between track select, record arm, solo and mute, we're hitting the stop solo mute button. Beyond session mode, we have our drum mode, which should be lighting up but isn't. I do have this keyboard with the current iteration of updates. Perhaps that'll change in the future. Right now, it just has not been working for me to light up in this mode as it should be. That aside, these buttons are hard mapped to MIDI notes. If I click on a piano and go into drum mode, drum mode has notes C1 to D sharp 2 mapped out in these 4-note ascending patterns. This is helpful if all your drums are in that register, but what happens when I want to play in drums, and I do like playing in drums on pads, is that I need far more than just C1 to D sharp 2 available to me. So the first thing that I did with custom modes is to actually go in and create an extension of the drum pad modes. So now I'm starting here, keeping the same pattern just for clarity. My custom mode that I use after that keeps going up the piano. And I have one more just so that I'm covered across all the octaves I might want percussion for. Now, in talking about all of these modes, I've kind of ignored the scale chord capacity, the user chord capacity, as well as just our scale modes that we have on this keyboard. So we can choose a root note and whatever scale we want, from major, minor, major, Dorian, Mixolydian, Phrygian, harmonic, minor, minor pentatonic, and major pentatonic. So that means that now if I play within this, I can play no notes wrong because I chose that major pentatonic scale mode. I'm turning off scale mode because it's not something that I particularly find useful within my workflow, but for some people it may be, because it means by activating a scale mode, which is selecting a root key in scale mode, and then selecting what kind of scale we want, you're never going to play a wrong note. For me, that's not that useful for my workflow, but for some people, you may really appreciate that feature. So we also have a way to extend our scale mode from simply the notes into scale chords. So right now we have our scale set to F Dorian. So if I now go to scale chords, these are all going to be within that. Depends on how useful you find that. We have our triads, then our seventh chords. So plain triad, triad with the seventh. Then we get into sevenths to ninths, so we're adding a note every time. To 6/9. You may find it useful. I don't tend to use it, but it is there as an option for inspiration. You can also create your own custom chords with user chords, but like I said, I tend not to use these. It's just not a part of my workflow. The fourth mode that I am using most commonly is actually a custom navigation mode that I created in order to navigate just playback and features like that. We'll take a closer look at custom modes and using Novation components shortly. Let's talk fader modes. Device mode is actually mapped to the track quick control settings in Cubase. So if we open up this lower panel on our inspector, you'll see that many contact instruments that I've opened, not all, will have quick controls set here. So if I have this set to device mode, that means now my first 8 faders are actually controlling the parameters listed within the quick controls on the Cubase track settings. So to select it, I would go Shift, Device, and now these are actually set up to modify the parameters within this instrument. So if I play a note, we can mess with our cutoff. Our attack, pull it down. Much slower attack. Our release, same concept. Really long release. Much shorter release. Saturation. There we go. A little hard to hear on this. Tells a 100. Stereo. Down to mono. And big pressure on this one. So these will be mapped to different settings depending on the instrument loaded. You can also select these for yourself in terms of track quick controls that you want mapped for instruments. Our next fader mode is volume mode. I tend not to use it because I prefer to set it in my track rather than screwing up here. Then our send A, in terms of how much send we want to our send A, our send to B, how much send signal we want sent to send to B. Then our 4 custom modes. So exactly what we did with the pads, we can do with the pots too. Our pot modes, we have a device pot mode, volume pot mode where they're now controlling volume, pan, this is one that our faders don't have. So we can control the panning on our bank of tracks and select tracks through here. And then we have our sends as well. So we can both do sends A, and then if we hold it, we can switch to send B. So just like our fader mode. Now they both can't be on the same mode at the same time, but we have the option of choosing our sends and our device and volume within the faders or within the pots. We also have our custom modes for the pots. So in case you want to map these to other controls within your instrument, within your DAW, you can do so with the controls here. For me, the custom modes are really where it's at with this controller because we can have 4 different custom pad modes loaded at any given moment, 4 different pot modes, and 4 different fader modes. So it gives us a lot of powerful customization that we can do in terms of our workflow with this keyboard. Okay, in this session, I have now opened some of the custom modes as well that I really like using with this keyboard. Personally, I tend to rely on the pad custom modes the most for my workflow, though the faders and the pots do have their advantages as well. I have my custom pads set up to be an extension of our drum pads. This is a good example of why I have more of an extension to the drum modes for my workflow. Right now in drum mode with this instrument, I don't actually have sounds loaded in this actual drum mode register that comes built in. Not until we get up here. So through my custom drum modes, I can now control more of this. depending on what we're doing, we now have that option. In Novation Components, these are the custom modes that I have set up for this keyboard. You'll see drum 2 are simply notes. You can select notes here, note messages versus control change versus program change versus keystroke messages. Keystroke is what allows us to use key commands or keyboard shortcuts. And you have parameters within here as well as colors that you can change, and including the on color if you want it to flash a certain color when on or off. So I have my drum modes set up as notes that are extension of the hardwired notes in the original drum mode on this. They all just continue climbing up the keyboard. Then navigation is my go-to pad mode that I have set up for this. So this is using primarily key commands within Cubase that are set to now the pads here. I can insert a marker or a cycle marker depending on what I'm doing. I can navigate to where markers 1 through 5 are. So I use these for the most important sections that I'm working on in tracks. Marker 1. This will jump me to marker 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then I have simply a fast forward and rewind in my transport here. I then have the option to open up my markers in case I need to change things. I have these mapped to open the right zone and the lower zone because depending on what I'm doing, sometimes I want those closed, sometimes I want those open. So it's just my quick mapping for lower zone and right zone. Mixer. Because on a Mac, you have to use function as well as F3 to get to the mixer quickly in Cubase, so I just mapped it to this so I can quickly pull up my mixer for my tracks. This button will take me back to Project Start. Then I also have locate my left locator and right locator, so my cursor is jumping to both of those locators. So fader modes, we have the same 4 custom options loaded at any one given point within fader modes. It's also really quick to load more options and send them to the keyboard should you need more modes in this. Just remember which channel you're loading them to if you are switching between more than 4 options in a session. So the mode that I use the most with this is when I create specific modes for instruments. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So this is a look at the custom fader mode that I created specifically for this woodwind library, which allows me to really get in there and automate the parameters that I want automated. From expression, vibrato rate, vibrato depth, attack time, key noise, flutter, growl effects, dynamic range, and attack accuracy. I also put some controls down here that I use frequently in mockups just to give me those options as well, to open the instrument itself, to change my grid to different notes, to duplicate the version of the instrument or create a new version of that in case I want to try something else, and then to cycle through the versions that I have on that track, close all plugins, and open up my controller lanes. So here's what that looks like in action. I have a flute sample loaded here. And I'm actually going to pull all my faders down because I'm going to start controlling from my attack to my vibrato depth. So here I'm controlling vibrato depth. As well as vibrato rate. Just to give myself more control. If I want a longer attack, shorter attack. If I want special effects like flutter tongue or growls. And just to give myself access to dynamic range. So with this library, I tend to use it especially just for my vibrato settings. Vibrato depth, how wide the vibrato is, too wide, and my vibrato rate, how fast or slow it is. So of course you can map these to be any custom modes that you want. As we saw within Novation components, that's my most used, is specifically having them mapped for instruments where the track quick control settings aren't what I want them to be. So it does take a little bit to kind of think through what you're going to be using in your workflow. What are some of the common buttons that you reach for, whether that's key commands, MIDI controllers, anything like that, program change messages that you might be using, and thinking about what those are going to be and then how to actually incorporate them within Novation components. And that way you can put it onto the keyboard. Now in this example, I have been entirely using this MIDI controller directly with Cubase through that USB port. However, you do have the option of a MIDI in, MIDI out, so you can use it for other controllers as well or in more complex setups. In terms of the quality of the keyboard itself, I find the keys to be really lightweight and responsive. Now remember that this is not a fully weighted keyboard and I'm not expecting it to be. However, frankly, fully weighted keyboards, unless you're really coming from a piano background and want something that really feels like a piano, you don't really need it. Quite frankly, if I need to play in trills or something like that, I'm going to prefer this keyboard versus my fully weighted keyboard. It'll just be faster and smoother. I do like the feel of the pads, the buttons, the faders, the pitch bend, the modulation wheel on this controller. There is enough resistance on the pitch bend and the modulation wheel, and I prefer that compared to some really low resistance modulation wheels or pitch bend where you just don't have much to work with as you're playing in. So I really like the feel of this one. The faders are the same way. They've got enough resistance that it actually feels like you're doing something versus somewhere you're moving them a little bit too easily. A couple things that I don't love about this is that the transpose option is a little bit hidden. So if you're used to using transpose on other MIDI controllers, just be aware that you can do so in this controller, even though there's no transpose button. You do need to hit shift plus the octave buttons to enable it into a transpose mode instead of octave mode. When I first got started with this keyboard, you had to unplug it in order for all the lights to go off, which was a little bit annoying because I don't like to leave lights on in my studio overnight. So I had to unplug it each night. However, there is a change on the recent firmware that allows us to hit shift and settings, and if we hold first shift and then settings, it will power off the lights. So now you don't have to unplug it at night if you don't want those lights on overnight. I do love the easy customization that is possible with the Novation components software for the pots, faders, and pads. It just has really helped my workflow once I found out what was useful to me. It did take me some time to figure out what are the key commands that I would be reaching for frequently, what are the MIDI controllers that I need mapped to these things. But once I had that set up, it was helpful to my workflow. Now that brings me to the point that this is a whole new MIDI controller. There is a learning curve. You're going to have to learn how it works for the MIDI controller and how it might be most useful to you. However, once you have something like that in place, it can be very helpful for a composing workflow.